Hello again, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist Bookshelf. I want to do a lot of podcasts on this book called The Truth in True Crime by J. Warner Wallace. I know I just did a podcast a little while ago on his intro in Chapter 1, but I'm going to come back more quickly to this book and work through it because it's so good and it's got so much wonderful information in here. So as you remember, when I mentioned it before, his organization is to use a police case, and then he ties it into a problem of life that people encounter and explains how the Christian worldview actually offers the best way for human flourishing. So we did Chapter 1 last time. Chapter 2 is called Fake IDs and a Stolen Identity, subtitled How to Write Better Bios. And he has two quotes to start it, and I like them both. One is Eric Erickson, who said, "In the social jungle of human existence, there's no feeling of being alive without a sense of identity." And then Shakespeare said this, "We know what we are, but not what we may be." So I'm not going to do his police stories. They're wonderful, but we'll skip over that and move on here because I want to get to the part where he talks about a virtue of life, something that we need to be doing, and why Christianity offers the best way to pursue that. And he talks about this time period. He said, we have an obsession these days with identity. He said every social media profile begins with some kind of handle, a name that we want to be known by. He said some people use real names and others use identifiers. He said those reveal what our values are and our interests, our desires, including how we want to be known by others. Now we craft bios, who we are, who we think we are at least, and how we want the world to view us. Now he said, even before social media came, when you were introduced to a stranger, what would they ask you? They'd ask your name, and they'd say, what do you do for a living? And said, but before the internet, we didn't really have a chance to identify ourselves publicly. And so he said, we used to be living in what he calls the information age, but he said he thinks it's really now the identity age. He said most of the information we seek or we talk about is related to somebody's identity if it's not our own. So he says we're living in what he calls an inside-out identity. The next section of his chapter here, he talks about what's subtitled Inside Out Identity. And he talks about a philosopher, Charles Taylor, who says that we're living in a culture in which people see themselves, he calls it atomistically. In other words, we're just little tiny chunks, and we're not bound to our fellow citizens and common projects and allegiances anymore. And boy, I see that a lot. I think that's true. So he said, with social media, he said what we're getting is an amplification of our sense of autonomy. In other words, it's all about us and only about us, and the power that it has, social media, to shift our priorities. Wallace has a section of his book called Inside Out Identity, and he said these days, thanks to social media and all, we're getting an amplification of our sense of autonomy. We are seeing ourselves, he says, kind of like individual atoms. We bump up against other people, but we're really not connecting to our fellow citizens. We don't have common projects or allegiances, so it's autonomy. We're on our own. He said we shape our identities from the inside out. That's where he gets that title, Inside Out Identity. We shape our identities starting with the desires of our heart. And then he says, think about these statements. Be yourself. Just be you. Live your truth. Follow your heart. He said those are the contemporary mantras we hear all the time of inside out identity. And how do we do that? We form our identity around some kind of personal characteristics or personal experiences. So some of the characteristics might be how we look physically, our abilities or our disabilities, the gender, our sexual attraction. As far as the personal experiences, it might be our relationships, our interests, our hobbies, our failures, our disappointments, or whatever. So he said, this is a problem though, right? An inside-out approach is unreliable. Why? Because it doesn't navigate very well the ever-changing desires that our hearts have and the unpredictable nature of life. Life changes so much. He said the problem here is that these inside-out identities lack any kind of objective moral foundation. So if my own personal attributes or my abilities and experiences determine my purpose in life, how can I be sure that that is a good identity or noble or virtuous? How could I be certain that I've lived a good life? Is a life well experienced the same as a life well lived? Can a serial killer live a good life if he celebrates his evil attributes and enjoys his murderous experiences? No. An inside-out approach, Wallace says, fails to guarantee an objectively virtuous life because it's subjective by nature, by definition. It's just inside of us, isn't it? It's not out in the world anywhere. So he said, instead of looking inward or outward, people should be looking upward, he says. And now here comes what he's talking about as far as the Bible goes. He says the Bible recognized our innate human desire to be known, and it did so way before modern sociologists came up with their study of how we got identity. In fact, you look at some of the Bible names, he mentions that Bible names were often given to people in recognition of their relationship to God. He said names would reflect value and character, revealing some kind of God-given role or purpose for the name bearer. And by the way, we don't do that anymore, do we? Names are picked because they're pretty or somebody in the family is named that way. But he gives examples here from the Bible. Simon was renamed Peter. That comes from a Greek word Petros, means rock or stone. So Jesus changed Simon's identity and purpose with a new name and told him that confession would be the rock on which the church would grow. He said the men and women in the Bible, if you look at them, they got their identities not from inside out identity, but from top side down, based on their connection and the relationship they had with their Creator. And he quotes a person named Joshua Holman, who said, while for Socrates the unexamined life is not worth living, for Christians the unrelated life is not worth living. So our relationship to God could define our identity if we let it, and provide purpose and direction when we relate to other people. Boy, is that true. That's so good. Instead of living like a little atom all unto ourselves, we live for God, and then he allows us and lets us reach out and relate to others. So back to Wallace here. He said if you have a top-side-down approach, that recognizes intentionality of our lives. We're not accidental products of evolution, according to the Bible. We're created to be uniquely in the image of God. Why? For a special purpose. Our identities are to be discovered based on what God's revealed. We don't create them based on just introspection. So our identities are discovered based on what God's revealed, but it's not created. Our identities aren't created based on public conformity or some kind of personal introspection. So our identity is not achieved through our effort, it's received. It's not achieved, it's received from our Creator. So he said that's why this top-down identity doesn't take a knockout blow if our desires or circumstances change. Isn't that good? Our top-down identity doesn't suffer. I mean, we may lose a job. Now, I'm just adding my own thoughts here, but we may lose a job. We might lose our health. We might lose a person who's really important in our life. And we may get our name taken off a building. But that doesn't suffer. That we will not suffer if we have a topside-down identity. Yeah, I like that a lot. It said a topside-down identity would protect us from us. Christ followers are supposed to be humble. We're supposed to have humility. We're supposed to consider others better and to serve others selflessly. We're not supposed to expect anything in return. And he said when people adopt that identity, when they adopt that purpose, they're less likely to be self-focused or self-loathing. That happens too. And now Wallace tells his story here. He said, in many times during his life, he didn't really want to submit his identity to God. He says, I wanted control. Well, don't we all? Isn't that the way it goes? We want to grab the steering wheel and run our own life, run the car in our own under our own direction. He said he wanted to define his own version of unique. He said, well, if that's your challenge as well, he said, I have good news. God doesn't ask us to stop being us, to be known as his. God is the source of our unique attributes. He gave us gifts. He gave us a distinctive personal history so we could find our place in his story. So when we identify ourselves in Jesus, we become part of a global community. There's not Jew or Greek. There's not slave or free, male or female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. And yet, in that oneness, God recognizes our unique gifts, abilities, and attributes. Oh man, that is so good. So he said, a topside-down identity allows me to be me. But unlike the identity I create for myself, if we have a God-centered identity, that recognizes our uniqueness, but it doesn't make us separate from other people. So we're not atoms again. We're actually interacting with other people. So we have been uniquely created by God to join people of all nations and all races. We're all unified in God's grand purpose. I love that a lot. So then the next section of his book, each chapter does this. He gives us the explanation from a biblical perspective. And then he said, all right. Then he gives a section of advice. He says, if you really want to know who you are, to define who you are, he said, turn to the mind of God. And then he gives some specific, very helpful pieces of advice. He does this in every chapter, and I think this is the greatest part of each chapter. So he says, here's one thing we can do. He calls it assess the mess. He says, ask yourself just a few honest questions. When you have shown your ID, when you introduce yourself to a stranger, how do you describe yourself on your social media accounts or your email signatures? Are you more focused on temporal traits than transcendent truths? Do your words give you away? Boy, those are good questions, huh? So he calls it assess the mess. Then the second thing he suggests, become his child. He said, if you haven't done so, join God's family. God adopts everybody. They'll receive him and believe in his name, giving them the right to become children of God. He said, if you already are a Christian, renew your mind, throw off your old self and your former way of life. Let God's Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. So put on a new self, created to be like God. Be intentional, he says, about embracing your family identity as a son or daughter of the King. So first piece of advice, assess the mess. 2, become his child. Here's the third one, listen to his voice. He said, if you've been trying to get your identity from the outside world or from your own personal feelings, you're listening to the wrong voices. You'll never replace what you're thinking about yourself if you don't first know what God thinks of you. So he says, start reading. According to the Bible, you are loved by God as his unique creation. He chose and adopted you as his own. He forgave you. He redeemed you through the sacrifice of Jesus. You're important. You're here for a reason. The creator of the universe called you and equipped you for every good work. Let me just stop there for a minute. I love Ephesians 2:10. He says we're God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good deeds, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Right? So he's got things for us to do. We should get moving on it. And then I like the fact that he says, you're important. You're here for a reason. Now, I'm a school teacher, and I can't tell you how many times I have heard either a direct or an indirect statement from students saying, I don't get it. What's the point? What's the purpose? I don't know why I should go on. That just breaks my heart because these are people that are not thinking of themselves as a unique creation and being loved by God. So there are 3 pieces of advice. Assess the mess, become his child, listen to his voice. Next one, live accordingly. He says, once you've discovered what God has to say about you, exchange it for what you or anybody else have been saying. Allow your identity as a child of God to direct your steps and inform your actions. He says Epictetus, who was a Greek philosopher, once advised, know first who you are and then adorn yourself accordingly. So he says, if we know who we are, we're going to change the way we interact with others. We're going to change our bios. We're going to be making decisions based on our new identity. Yeah. And then toward the end of the chapter, he says there's a psychologist who said this, the need to be known and valued by self and others is humanity's core need. He says that's the single most important variable in human development in terms of outcomes regarding character structure and well-being. So we need to know and be valued by ourselves and others. Now, he said, a psychologist like that is just affirming what ancient Christians described on the pages of the New Testament. And if you believe the biblical worldview, humans were created to be known and find their identity in God. He said the Christian story is an identity story from start to finish. It begins with God providing identity to the first created humans. They then assign names, identities to other living creatures. And the Bible story ends with God giving his name to Jesus, who surrendered all these privileges that he had of his divine identity so he could identify with us. Isn't that amazing? Oh, wow. In my world here, we're coming up on Christmas, and to think God entered this world to share identities with us. Wow. At the end of the chapter, he says the Christian identity story addresses our core need, and it did so way before modern sociologists understood the importance of this desire. So when we trust Jesus for our salvation, Wallace says, we change our identities as fallen, imperfect creatures, destined for the grave. We're redeemed children of God who have life in his name. According to the Bible, there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. So he said, our need to be known and valued by ourselves and others is just kind of a temporary, poor reflection of our need to be known by God. We seek identity and purpose. Why? Because we were created for identity and purpose in God. We were created to be known, not simply by other created beings, but by the Creator himself. Oh man, that's good. So this just gives you an idea of the kinds of things that he does in this book. I think it's terrific. So what he's saying is that we've got all of these attributes to help us flourish, things like our identity, which this chapter talked about, friendships, marriage, humility, contentment in work, making sense of bad things that happen to you. I mean, on and on and on. This is what his book is going to cover. If we can correctly handle these things, we will flourish as human beings. And Wallace is going to point out that this kind of human flourishing comes about best if we adopt the Christian worldview. So I really appreciate him for writing this. One person on the back said, I've been waiting for Wallace to write a book like this. And another person said it's an eye-opening journey to discover the truth, and I would agree with that. So anything by J. Warner Wallace is excellent. His website is coldcasechristianity.com. I know you get a lot out of that as well. And so thanks. I'm going to be coming back to this really often. And if you have a chance, pick up a copy. It's an excellent book. It's the kind of book, in my case, that I'd like to share with my grandkids, give them some of these pointers to life. It's good for families. Just talking about these things, how do we live a life that is abundant, that is full, that is not just making money. And so we've lost that, I think, in today's world. There are so many people unhappy. They know that what they're doing is not amounting to anything. They're just putting in time. And so Wallace, I think this is a wise book, and it deserves to be on every shelf. Okay, well, thanks so much. Let's do another podcast soon.